Welcome to Mystery Stories, where quiet villages hold long memories and polite smiles often hide uneasy truths. Here, every story unfolds gently, through whispered gossip, careful observations, and the kind of small details most people overlook. These are mysteries meant to be listened to slowly, like a voice across the table over evening tea. Calm on the surface, thoughtful beneath. There are no sudden shocks here, only the steady pull of curiosity as ordinary lives reveal their secrets. Settle in, listen closely, and let each promise, silence, and sideways glance guide you into a world where truth always waits patiently to be noticed. Chapter 1. The remark was made so softly that it almost slipped past unnoticed. A mild comment about how some promises had a way of lingering long after everyone agreed they should be forgotten. It was spoken while the kettle was still singing and the cups had not yet been set down. And yet the room changed the moment the words settled. Miss Marple felt it at once, the faint tightening in the air, the way voices paused as if someone had quietly closed a door. She did not look up immediately. She rarely did when something interesting revealed itself. Instead, she finished adjusting the teaspoon beside her saucer and listened, allowing the silence to speak for itself. The village looked as it always did that morning, neat and composed under a pale sky. The church bells ringing with a confidence that suggested nothing had ever gone wrong here at all. Neighbors passed one another with polite smiles that lingered just long enough to be courteous but not long enough to invite conversation. Miss Marple arrived without ceremony. Her visit explained in the simplest terms: a short stay, a change of scene, nothing to trouble anyone. She liked arriving that way, without expectations, without anyone feeling the need to perform. It allowed her to watch people as they truly were, or as close to it as they ever allowed themselves to be. Inside the house where she was staying, the morning tea had been arranged with care. The table was set neatly, the china well matched, the chairs placed at comfortable distances, as though harmony could be measured in inches. Miss Marple took her seat with a gentle word of thanks, her manner mild, her presence easy to overlook. She noticed everything at once, of course, the faint tremor in the hostess's hands as she poured, the way the sugar bowl had been moved twice and still seemed not quite right, the glance exchanged between two women when the door was closed. None of it seemed remarkable on its own. Taken together, it suggested a quiet strain, like a wire pulled too tight beneath a pleasant surface. Conversation began in the usual way. Remarks about the weather, the condition of the road near the green, the upcoming church gathering. Miss Marple listened with the polite attention expected of a guest, adding a word here and there, never pressing, never leading. It was only when someone mentioned how quickly time passed, how years could disappear before one quite noticed, that the room grew careful. Another voice followed, lightly at first, speaking of old days, and how people had once promised things they could never keep. That was when the cups paused, just for a fraction of a second, suspended between table and lips. Miss Marple saw it clearly, the stillness that came not from distraction but from calculation. One woman lowered her cup slowly, too slowly, as if hoping the moment might pass if she did not rush it. Another smiled, though the smile held no warmth, only an expectation that the subject would be changed at once. The hostess laughed a little too brightly and suggested more tea, her voice rising at the end of the sentence. Miss Marple accepted her refill with thanks, her eyes kind, her thoughts already at work. Gossip, she knew, rarely announced itself plainly. It drifted, disguised as memory, cloaked in concern. Before long, the talk had turned, as village talk so often did, to small matters that carried larger shadows. Someone mentioned a recent expense, dismissed as unfortunate but necessary. Another spoke of how difficult things had become for certain people, how money never seemed to stretch as far as it once had. Miss Marple listened, her expression sympathetic, though she noted how often one name was avoided, how another was repeated with unnecessary emphasis. The past engagement was mentioned almost by accident, as if it had slipped out against the speaker's will. A brief silence followed. then a careful explanation that it had all been for the best, that young people often made promises without understanding what they truly meant. Miss Marple nodded gently, agreeing that youth did tend to be hopeful. Yet she noticed how one woman's shoulders eased at the mention, as though relieved that the matter was finally being acknowledged, while another stiffened, her fingers tightening around her napkin. Someone insisted, rather firmly, that such things belonged firmly in the past, and should remain there. The words were spoken with conviction, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the louder the insistence, the deeper the unease beneath it. She wondered what exactly was being guarded so fiercely, and from whom. When she asked a mild question about how long ago it had all been, the answer came too quickly, rehearsed, and was followed by an abrupt change of subject. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the letter. It lay on the sideboard, half hidden beneath a folded cloth, as though it had been placed there in haste and forgotten. The envelope was plain, unremarkable, yet its seal had been broken, and not neatly, but with a tear that suggested impatience. No one else seemed to see it, or perhaps they had seen it too often already. Miss Marple's gaze rested on it only briefly before returning to her cup, but the details settled firmly in her mind. As the morning wore on, people came and went, offering greetings, exchanging pleasantries. Each new arrival seemed to test the room, measuring what could be said and what must be avoided. Miss Marple observed how one visitor glanced immediately toward the sideboard, how another positioned herself carefully between it and the rest of the room. A remark was made about letters being such unreliable things, how words on paper could be misunderstood. The comment was accompanied by a laugh that did not invite agreement. Miss Marple spoke very little, content to let others fill the space. When she did speak, it was with the gentle curiosity of someone who meant no harm, asking about the village, its customs, its history. She was told, with some pride, that it was a place that valued discretion, that respected privacy. She smiled at that, agreeing that such qualities were rare and valuable. Yet she could not help noticing how often discretion seemed to serve as a shield rather than a courtesy. Later, as the gathering thinned, Miss Marple found herself alone for a moment with the hostess, who apologized for the slight tension, explaining it away as nerves. Miss Marple assured her it was nothing at all, that villages were full of old stories, and old stories had a habit of resurfacing at inconvenient times. The hostess nodded, though her eyes flicked once more toward the sideboard before she excused herself. Left alone, Miss Marple rose and moved closer, not to the letter itself, but to the window beside it, peering out as if admiring the garden. From there, she could see the envelope clearly enough to note the handwriting, neat but strained, the ink pressed heavily into the paper. She did not touch it. She never needed to. Observation was quite enough. When she returned to her seat, footsteps sounded in the hall, and voices lowered instinctively. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression serene. She reflected that promises, once made, had a peculiar weight to them. They shaped expectations, altered decisions, and when broken, left behind more than disappointment. They left questions. As she took her leave later that morning, the village greeted her with the same polite smiles she had seen on her arrival. Nothing appeared changed, and yet Miss Marple felt certain that something had shifted, just slightly, like the first movement before a storm. She smiled kindly in return, her manner untroubled, while her thoughts turned over the letter, the pause in conversation, the relief and the resistance she had seen so clearly. A promise meant to be forgotten, she reflected, rarely caused such careful silences. And as she walked down the quiet lane, Miss Marple could not help but feel that she had just glimpsed the first shadow of something far more troubling than village gossip. Chapter 2. The whisper reached Miss Marple just as the final note of the hymn faded. A soft remark about how some people never quite sat in the same place twice anymore, as if the wooden pews themselves remembered old loyalties. It was said lightly, almost with humor, yet it lingered longer than the echo of the organ. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment after others rose, her eyes lowered, her attention fixed not on the altar, but on the subtle movements around her. The careful adjustments, the small hesitations that spoke far more clearly than words ever could. The church was full that morning, filled with familiar faces arranged in patterns shaped by habit and history. Miss Marple noticed at once how the village sorted itself, not by chance, but by quiet agreement. Some sat together, as they always had, shoulders almost touching, sharing hymn books without discussion. Others chose the edges, leaving a careful space beside them, as though distance itself offered protection. She observed one woman pause halfway down the aisle, glance toward a particular pew, and then continue past it, settling several rows away instead. No one remarked upon it, yet several people had noticed all the same. As the congregation stood, Miss Marple saw a hand tighten briefly on the back of a pew, knuckles paling before relaxing again. She saw a quick look exchanged between two men who did not usually acknowledge one another at all. When the prayer ended and heads lifted, the polite calm returned, smooth and well-practiced. To anyone unfamiliar with the village, it would have seemed an entirely ordinary service. To Miss Marple, it felt like a room full of conversations that had been carefully postponed. Outside, the air was cool and clear, the churchyard bright with the quiet order of well-tended paths. People lingered, as they always did, reluctant to go home too quickly, eager to exchange news that had no proper place inside. Miss Marple joined a small group near the gate, her presence welcomed without fuss. She listened as remarks drifted from the state of the weather to the condition of the road, then, almost inevitably, to the behavior of those who were not present. Someone mentioned, in a tone of mild concern, that Mrs. Hargreaves had left early, which was unlike her. Another replied that she had seemed tired lately, no doubt worn down by worry. Miss Marple noted how quickly the explanation was offered, how smoothly it closed off further discussion. A younger woman laughed and said everyone worried too much, though her eyes moved restlessly across the gathering as she spoke. There was talk of money, introduced obliquely, through complaints about rising costs and shrinking allowances. Miss Marple observed that certain names surfaced again and again, always accompanied by sympathy, while others were conspicuously absent. When she asked, in her gentle way, whether the harvest had been particularly poor this year, the answer she received was vague, unsatisfying, and delivered with a glance toward the church door, as though the walls themselves might be listening. As people began to drift away, Miss Marple walked slowly along the path, content to let others set the pace. Near the old yew tree, she overheard two women speaking in low voices, their heads inclined toward one another. One spoke of how difficult it must be to live with uncertainty, never knowing whether what had been promised would truly be honored. The other replied that some promises were better left unexamined. The words were followed by a nervous laugh, quickly stifled when they noticed Miss Marple nearby. She smiled at them kindly, offering a pleasant remark about the weather, and they responded with equal politeness, though their conversation did not resume. Miss Marple continued on her way, reflecting that it was often the conversations that ended too abruptly which proved the most revealing. Later, at a small gathering for luncheon, the atmosphere was lighter. Deliberately so. Plates were passed, compliments exchanged, and laughter encouraged. Miss Marple took her seat at the edge of the table, content to observe. She noticed how one woman spoke at length about generosity and kindness, her tone earnest, her eyes bright. Another listened in silence, her attention fixed on her plate, her appetite clearly diminished. A remark was made about the past, framed as nostalgia, a recollection of how close everyone had once been. Miss Marple saw how one man's expression softened at the memory, while another's hardened. Someone commented that things had been simpler then, that people understood their place. The statement was met with nods and murmurs of agreement, though Miss Marple suspected that not everyone present remembered those days in quite the same way. As the meal continued, she noticed a subtle change in behavior. A woman who had been animated earlier now spoke only when addressed directly. A man who had remained quiet began to fill the silence with unnecessary detail. Miss Marple recognized the pattern at once. Anxiety, she knew, often expressed itself in extremes, either retreat or excess. She engaged the quieter woman in conversation, asking about her garden, a topic generally safe and reassuring. The response was polite but distracted, her gaze drifting toward the doorway as though expecting someone to appear. Miss Marple followed the look, noting that the door remained firmly closed. When she mentioned, casually, that the house felt larger than it must have once been, the woman nodded quickly, agreeing too readily. Someone mentioned, in passing, that there had been a meeting the previous evening. A small one, nothing formal. The comment was immediately softened, dismissed as unimportant. Miss Marple's interest was piqued all the same. She asked who had attended, her tone merely curious. The answers were imprecise, contradictory. One person insisted it had been only a brief conversation. Another claimed not to remember it at all. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. She had learned to pay close attention to memory, particularly when it failed so conveniently. As she listened, she noticed how the mention of the meeting caused one guest to straighten suddenly, as though bracing herself. Another reached for her cup, knocking it slightly against the saucer. No one apologized for the sound. As the gathering drew to a close, Miss Marple rose to leave, thanked her hostess, and made her way toward the door. Just before she stepped outside, she heard a voice behind her, lowered but urgent, saying that it would all be over soon, that arrangements had been made. The reply came too softly to be heard, but the tone carried a note of doubt. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lane. Miss Marple walked slowly, allowing her thoughts to settle. She reflected on the way people had spoken of the past, with such careful selection, such deliberate omissions. She considered the meeting no one wished to describe, the promise no one wished to define. Above all, she thought of the way relief and fear seemed to exist side by side, sometimes within the same person. When she reached the end of the lane, she paused, looking back toward the village. It appeared peaceful, unchanged, the very picture of quiet respectability. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances alone. She had seen too many small communities undone not by grand gestures, but by ordinary people making ordinary choices for the wrong reasons. As she resumed her walk, her smile returned, gentle and unassuming. She had not asked many questions, and those she had asked seemed harmless enough. Still, she felt certain that she had learned a great deal. Someone, she suspected, was waiting for the past to remain silent just a little longer. And Miss Marple, listening to the distant murmur of voices behind her, could not help but wonder what would happen when that silence finally refused to hold. Chapter 3. The first sign of strain appeared in the careful way the table had been set, as though someone had measured each place twice, and still worried it might not be right. Miss Marple noticed it the moment she entered the room. The symmetry just a touch too perfect. The chairs positioned with an anxious precision that suggested more than a desire for tidiness. Afternoon tea was meant to be a comfort in this village, a pause in the day where conversation flowed easily and old friendships softened the sharpness of life. Today, however, there was a faint stiffness beneath the china and linen, a sense that every gesture had been rehearsed. Miss Marple greeted her host warmly and took her seat with an air of mild gratitude, as though nothing here could possibly surprise her. The room itself was pleasant enough, light filtering through lace curtains, the familiar scent of brewed tea and warm pastries settling gently in the air. Yet, even before the first cup was poured, she sensed the quiet alertness of those gathered, the way eyes flicked toward one another, and then away again, the way voices began a fraction too brightly. Conversation opened with the expected remarks, praise for the cakes, mild complaints about the weather, a brief exchange about the state of the garden. Miss Marple listened with interest, offering small comments that invited others to speak. She watched how one woman spoke freely, almost eagerly, while another smiled politely, without contributing at all. When the cups were passed, she noticed a place set at the far end of the table, untouched, its napkin folded neatly beside an empty chair. Someone remarked, lightly, that it was a shame when people could not attend, that life had a way of pulling everyone in different directions. The comment was accompanied by a quick glance toward the empty place, then away again. Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically, her eyes lingering just long enough to take in the detail. An empty chair, she reflected, often said more than an occupied one. As the tea was poured, the talk drifted, as it so often did, toward the past. Not the distant past, comfortably remote, but the nearer sort, still close enough to touch. A woman laughed softly, and recalled how close everyone had once been, how nothing had seemed impossible then. The laughter faded almost at once, replaced by a thoughtful pause. Miss Marple noticed how another guest adjusted her cup on the saucer, aligning it carefully, as though order might be restored by such small corrections. The past engagement surfaced again, not named directly, but hinted at through phrases about youthful plans and roads not taken. One woman remarked that things rarely turned out as expected, that perhaps it was better not to dwell on what might have been. Her voice held a firmness that sat oddly with the sentiment. Across the table, someone else nodded, though her expression suggested relief rather than agreement. Miss Marple spoke then, softly, commenting that villages had long memories, that stories often remained even when the people involved had moved on. The remark was met with polite murmurs, though one woman stiffened slightly, her gaze fixed on her teacup. Miss Marple noted it, filing it away with the other small changes she had observed. A discussion about loyalty followed, framed as a general observation, nothing personal at all. Someone suggested that loyalty was a rare thing these days, easily tested by circumstance. Another replied that loyalty could be complicated, especially when obligations were unclear. The exchange was civil, almost academic, yet Miss Marple sensed the undercurrent beneath it, the personal weight carried by each carefully chosen word. As the conversation continued, Miss Marple noticed that the empty chair had not gone unremarked. A guest finally asked, in a tone of mild curiosity, whether someone else had been expected. The hostess replied quickly that it had been a misunderstanding, that no one else was coming after all. The answer came too easily, and Miss Marple observed how the hostess avoided meeting anyone's eyes as she spoke. She took a sip of tea and let the moment pass, understanding that such explanations were rarely offered without reason. When she remarked that misunderstandings were common, particularly when old arrangements were involved, the hostess smiled, though the smile did not quite settle. The conversation shifted again, this time toward domestic matters. Someone mentioned a recent change in household routines, explained as a simple adjustment. Miss Marple noticed how the speaker hesitated before offering the explanation, as though weighing its adequacy. Another guest spoke of how unsettling it could be when familiar patterns were disrupted, her tone more serious than the topic seemed to require. Miss Marple asked a gentle question about how long these changes had been in place, her voice mild, her interest apparently casual. The response was vague, the timeline blurred. One person suggested it had been weeks, another insisted it was far more recent. The discrepancy went unchallenged, yet Miss Marple took note of it all the same. As plates were cleared and fresh tea poured, the mood lightened briefly. There was laughter, genuine enough, and a sense of shared familiarity that reminded Miss Marple why villages like this were so valued. Yet, even in the midst of it, she observed the small signs of strain. A woman's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the sugar. Another leaned back in her chair, distancing herself from the table, as though unconsciously withdrawing. A remark about responsibility was made, framed as a joke, though it fell flat. Someone responded too quickly, insisting that everyone had done their best, that no one could have foreseen how things would turn out. Miss Marple listened, her expression thoughtful. She wondered who exactly needed that reassurance. The hostess rose to fetch something from another room, leaving the group momentarily unattended. In her absence, the conversation grew quieter, more cautious. Miss Marple heard a whispered comment about how difficult it must be to live with unresolved matters, followed by a quick glance toward the doorway. The whisperer fell silent when Miss Marple's gaze met hers, then offered a polite smile. When the hostess returned, she carried with her a folded cloth, which she placed carefully over the sideboard, concealing what lay beneath. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward it, recognizing the motion as deliberate. The cloth rested unevenly, its edge catching on the corner of something solid beneath. A letter, perhaps, or a bundle of papers. The hostess adjusted it quickly, her movements brisk. Miss Marple commented on the warmth of the room, and the hostess agreed a little too eagerly, opening a window at once. Fresh air rushed in, carrying with it the sounds of the village beyond. The moment passed, yet Miss Marple felt certain she had witnessed something worth remembering. As the gathering began to break up, people lingered longer than necessary, exchanging final words with a careful courtesy. Miss Marple stood, thanking her hostess sincerely, and was rewarded with a smile that held both relief and unease. Near the door, she overheard a final remark, spoken low and fast, about how some attachments never truly faded, no matter how much time passed. Outside, the afternoon light was soft, the village calm. Miss Marple walked slowly away, reflecting on the empty chair, the concealed sideboard, the way certain names hovered just beyond the edge of speech. She considered how attachments once formed could become burdens as easily as comforts. By the time she reached the end of the lane, she felt certain that the past engagement was far from a harmless memory. It lingered still, shaping behavior, sharpening tempers, and unsettling routines. Someone, she suspected, had hoped it would remain safely unresolved. And Miss Marple, her expression gentle as ever, could not help but feel that the quiet tensions she had observed were only the beginning, the first signs of a conflict that was no longer content to remain politely hidden. Chapter 4. The letters were offered as though they were nothing more than a mild curiosity, an old bundle brought out to pass the time on a quiet afternoon. Yet Miss Marple sensed at once that their appearance was anything but accidental. They lay on the small writing desk near the window, neatly stacked and tied with a faded ribbon, their corners softened by age and repeated handling. The hostess spoke of them lightly, mentioning how she had been sorting through drawers and thought Miss Marple, with her interest in village history, might find them amusing. Miss Marple thanked her, her tone warm, though her attention sharpened the moment she saw how carefully the bundle had been placed. Angled just so, as if inviting notice while pretending not to do so. The room was hushed, the sort of stillness that settled when people expected something to be said, but were uncertain who should say it first. Miss Marple took a seat near the desk, not reaching for the letters at once, but allowing her gaze to wander instead. She observed how one woman hovered by the fireplace, smoothing her skirt again and again, while another positioned herself between Miss Marple and the doorway, her posture polite but alert. No one suggested tea. That omission alone told Miss Marple a great deal. When she finally picked up the bundle, she did so gently, as though the contents were fragile in more than one sense. The ribbon came away easily, too easily, suggesting it had been untied not long ago. Miss Marple did not comment on this. She unfolded the first letter slowly, reading just enough to understand its tone before setting it aside. It was earnest, hopeful, written in a hand that leaned forward with enthusiasm. The second, however, was different. The words were more cautious, the phrasing careful, as though the writer had already begun to measure the cost of honesty. Someone remarked, a little too quickly, that such letters were common once, that everyone wrote in those days, that it meant very little. Miss Marple nodded agreeably, saying how fortunate it was to have such records of the past. She noticed how the speaker watched her face closely, searching for some sign of judgment. Miss Marple offered none. As she moved through the letters, she became aware of small inconsistencies. Dates that seemed oddly spaced, references to meetings that did not align with what she had already been told. One letter appeared to have been rewritten, its tone gentler than the sharpness suggested by earlier correspondence. Miss Marple remarked upon the change casually, observing how people often softened their words when they feared causing distress. The comment was met with a brief silence, followed by a murmur of agreement that sounded more like relief. A woman by the window spoke then, confessing, almost proudly, that she had intervened years ago when emotions were running too high. She explained that it had been necessary, that someone had to think practically. Miss Marple listened attentively, noting how the story was delivered with a practiced confidence, as though it had been repeated many times. When she asked, in her gentle way, whether everyone involved had agreed with that decision, the answer came hesitantly, wrapped in vague assurances. Miss Marple turned another letter over, studying the handwriting rather than the words. She observed how the pressure of the pen varied, how certain lines were pressed deeply into the page, as if written in agitation. She mentioned, almost absently, that such details often revealed more than the words themselves. Someone laughed nervously, dismissing the idea as fanciful. Miss Marple smiled, unoffended. The conversation shifted toward circumstances that had followed those letters. Improvements in fortune explained away as luck or hard work. Miss Marple noted how the timing aligned rather neatly with the disappearance of the promise she had heard so much about. She commented that life did have a way of rewarding decisive action. The remark drew a sharp look from one guest, quickly concealed behind a sip of tea that had appeared at last. As the afternoon wore on, the letters were gathered up again, tied once more with the faded ribbon. Miss Marple noticed how carefully they were returned to the desk, placed slightly farther back this time. The hostess laughed lightly and said it was foolish to dwell on such things, that the past could not be changed. Miss Marple agreed, adding that it could, however, be understood. The laughter faltered. Just briefly, a visitor arrived unexpectedly, her entrance greeted with a flicker of surprise that she quickly tried to smooth away. She spoke of having been nearby, of calling in on impulse. Miss Marple observed how her eyes went at once to the desk, how her smile tightened when she saw the letters secured. A remark was made about how fortunate it was that everything had worked out in the end. The visitor nodded, though her expression suggested uncertainty rather than agreement. Miss Marple asked, quite innocently, whether there had ever been talk of revisiting the old arrangements, if only for peace of mind. The question landed heavily, drawing a careful response about how reopening such matters would only cause trouble. Someone added, firmly, that certain promises were better left unspoken. Miss Marple inclined her head, as though conceding the point, while privately noting the fear beneath the firmness. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused by the desk once more, commenting on how well the letters had been preserved. The hostess replied that she had always meant to put them away properly, though something had always stopped her. Miss Marple smiled kindly, suggesting that unfinished business had a way of making itself known. Outside, the light was beginning to fade, shadows lengthening across the village green. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts returning to the rewritten letter, the interventions spoken of with such pride, the improvements that had followed so conveniently. She reflected that truth was rarely erased entirely. More often, it was edited, revised until it barely resembled itself. By the time she reached her door, Miss Marple felt certain that the letters were not merely relics of youthful affection. They were evidence, quietly waiting, their meaning reshaped by those who feared what might happen if they were read too closely. And Miss Marple, her expression calm but thoughtful, knew that the past was no longer content to remain bound with a ribbon, and that whatever had been altered all those years ago was beginning, at last, to press back against its carefully rewritten story. Chapter 5. The unease made itself known in the smallest of ways. In the manor, doors were closed a little too softly, and voices lowered even when no one else seemed near. Miss Marple noticed it the moment she stepped out into the village street that morning. The sense that people were moving around an invisible obstacle, careful not to disturb something resting just beneath the surface. The shops opened as usual, curtains drawn back, signs set straight. Yet the rhythm felt altered, as though the village itself were listening. She walked slowly, greeting those she passed with a pleasant nod and a few words about the fine stretch of weather. The replies came readily enough, but Miss Marple observed how often eyes flicked past her shoulder, how conversations faltered the moment someone else drew near. Near the baker's window, she overheard a remark about how difficult it was to keep everything in order when routines changed unexpectedly. The comment was met with a tight smile and a swift change of subject. Miss Marple filed it away, reflecting that routine, once disturbed, rarely settled again without consequence. At the corner of the green, she paused to admire the flowers arranged near the memorial, noting how carefully they had been tended. A woman stood nearby, adjusting a ribbon that had slipped loose, her movements precise, almost frantic. Miss Marple commented kindly on the display, and the woman responded with gratitude that felt slightly exaggerated. When Miss Marple remarked that it must take time to keep everything looking so well managed, the woman hesitated before agreeing, her gaze drifting toward a nearby house and then back again. As Miss Marple continued on her way, she encountered a small group engaged in quiet conversation. Their voices dropped further when she approached, though she was welcomed with polite smiles. One of them mentioned, in a tone of weary acceptance, that things were never quite the same once arrangements were altered. Another replied that some changes were unavoidable, especially when people failed to keep their word. The exchange ended there, both speakers suddenly intent on the ground beneath their feet. Miss Marple joined them briefly, her manner unassuming. She spoke of how villages depended on shared understanding, on people knowing where they stood. The group murmured agreement, though one man shifted his weight uneasily, his hands clasped behind his back. When Miss Marple asked whether there had been many changes recently, the answers were vague, carefully phrased to reveal nothing specific. She sensed that everyone present understood exactly what she meant, even if no one was willing to say it aloud. Later, at a nearby house, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to sit for a while. The sitting room was tidy, almost excessively so, every object aligned with careful intent. She noticed how a framed photograph had been turned slightly away from the light, its subject indistinct from where she sat. The hostess spoke cheerfully about household matters. Yet Miss Marple observed how her hands never quite stilled, fingers brushing the edge of the table, adjusting a cushion that did not need adjusting. The conversation turned, as it so often did, toward responsibility. The hostess remarked that people sometimes forgot what they owed one another, that kindness could be mistaken for weakness. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, adding that obligations, once assumed, had a way of shaping lives in unexpected ways. The hostess laughed, though there was little humor in it, and said that it was best not to dwell on such things. Miss Marple glanced toward the sideboard and noticed a small object placed there, half hidden behind a vase. It appeared to be a key, old-fashioned, its metal dulled with age. She did not comment on it at once. Instead, she asked about the photograph she had glimpsed earlier, remarking how photographs often preserved moments people preferred to forget. The hostess stiffened slightly before replying that it was nothing of importance, merely an old reminder. When Miss Marple casually mentioned that she had noticed a number of people adjusting their routines lately, the hostess sighed and admitted that it had been a difficult time. She spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry, all without offering any clear reason for either. Miss Marple listened attentively, her expression kind, though she could not help noticing how often the hostess's gaze strayed toward the key on the sideboard. A visitor arrived unexpectedly, her entrance greeted with a forced brightness that did not quite mask the tension beneath. She apologized for calling unannounced, explaining that she had been passing and thought it best to check in. Miss Marple observed the way the hostess's smile tightened, how the visitor's eyes swept the room with careful attention. The two exchanged pleasantries, their words polite, their tones strained. The visitor remarked that she hoped everything was settled now, that there would be no more unpleasantness. The hostess replied that she certainly hoped so, her voice firm, though her posture suggested otherwise. Miss Marple commented lightly that unsettled matters often had a way of resurfacing when least expected. Both women laughed, though the sound rang hollow. As tea was brought in, Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor in the hostess's hands, the teacups rattling softly against their saucers. The visitor spoke of how exhausting it was to maintain appearances, how one longed for peace and quiet. Miss Marple agreed, adding that peace was rarely achieved by avoidance alone. The remark was met with a brief silence, broken only by the clink of a spoon. The visitor glanced toward the sideboard and asked, with apparent casualness, whether everything was accounted for now. The hostess responded quickly, too quickly, assuring her that it was. Miss Marple noted how the key had been moved slightly, turned so that it lay fully concealed behind the vase. She wondered what it opened, and why its presence should matter so much. When the visitor took her leave, the hostess seemed to sag with relief, her composure slipping for just a moment. Miss Marple spoke gently, offering reassurance, though she could not help observing that relief and fear often walked hand in hand. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that promises carried weight long after they were made, that they shaped expectations even when people pretended otherwise. The hostess looked up sharply, then smiled, and said nothing. Outside, the day had grown overcast, clouds gathering without urgency. Miss Marple walked back toward her lodgings, passing familiar faces that greeted her warmly enough. Yet she sensed a growing restlessness beneath the surface calm, a feeling that something was being carefully contained. She recalled the key, the guarded remarks, the way responsibility had been discussed as both burden and weapon. At the edge of the green, she overheard a fragment of conversation carried on the breeze. A voice saying that it could not continue like this, that something would have to be done. The reply was lost to distance, but the urgency lingered. Miss Marple paused, considering the many small signs she had gathered, the domestic details that hinted at larger truths. By the time she reached her door, she felt certain that the promise at the heart of all this was no longer merely a memory. It had become a source of pressure, shaping decisions and fraying tempers. Someone, she suspected, believed that everything could still be controlled, kept neat and orderly like the sitting room she had just left. And Miss Marple, resting her hand briefly on the latch before going inside, knew that such careful arrangements rarely held forever, and that the weight of small things, once ignored, had a way of tipping quietly into something far more serious. Chapter 6. The change announced itself not through raised voices or open disagreement, but in the way politeness had begun to stretch thin, like fabric worn too often. Miss Marple sensed it the moment she entered the drawing room that evening, invited along with several others for what was described as a simple gathering. Nothing formal, just a chance to sit together and put recent uneasiness to rest. The room was warmly lit, the chairs arranged in a careful circle, yet the atmosphere felt unsettled, as though the arrangement had been calculated rather than chosen. Miss Marple took her seat quietly and observed. She always found that evenings revealed more than mornings ever could. People were tired by then, their careful manners worn down just enough for truth to show through the cracks. Conversation began pleasantly, with remarks about the comfort of the chairs and the quality of the tea, though Miss Marple noticed how often people glanced toward the door, as if expecting someone else to arrive, or hoping they would not. A man seated near the window spoke at length about how important it was to maintain harmony. His tone earnest, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Miss Marple listened with interest, noting how his speech grew more elaborate as he went on, as though he feared silence might invite questions. Across from him, a woman nodded frequently, agreeing with everything he said, yet her eyes betrayed a restlessness that suggested she was thinking of something else entirely. Miss Marple contributed little at first, content to listen. She remarked only that villages had a way of feeling disagreements more acutely than cities, where people could simply disappear into the crowd. The observation was met with murmurs of agreement, though one woman shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her gaze fixed on the carpet. The conversation turned toward the idea of fairness, introduced gently, almost academically. Someone suggested that fairness depended on perspective, that what seemed reasonable to one person might feel unjust to another. Another replied that promises existed precisely to prevent such misunderstandings. The word lingered in the air, heavy despite its calm delivery. Miss Marple noticed the effect immediately. A man who had been leaning back straightened suddenly, his expression alert. A woman reached for her cup, her hand faltering just enough to send a soft rattle through the saucer. No one commented on it. Instead, the hostess laughed lightly and suggested more tea, rising at once as though movement itself might ease the tension. As she poured, Miss Marple observed how her hands trembled, the stream of tea unsteady despite her effort to control it. She apologized quickly, blaming the weight of the pot, though Miss Marple suspected the explanation was offered more for reassurance than accuracy. When the cups were passed around, Miss Marple accepted hers with thanks, meeting the hostess's eyes briefly. There was a plea there, quickly hidden. A remark was made about how tiring it was to manage everyone's expectations, to keep matters from becoming complicated. Miss Marple responded gently that complications often arose when matters were left unspoken. The reply drew a brief silence, followed by a hurried agreement that some things were best left alone. The tone was firm, almost defensive. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple noticed how certain people seemed drawn into conversation while others hovered at the edges. One woman spoke very little, her answers brief and cautious. Miss Marple engaged her with an innocuous question about her recent activities, and the woman replied politely, though her eyes darted toward the hostess before settling again. Miss Marple noted the glance, wondering what permission she felt she required. The talk shifted to arrangements made earlier in the week, a meeting mentioned only in passing. Someone claimed it had been brief and inconclusive. Another suggested it had resolved everything that needed resolving. The two statements sat uneasily together, and Miss Marple observed how no one attempted to reconcile them. When she asked, mildly, whether everyone had been present, the answers were hesitant, contradictory. Miss Marple sipped her tea and reflected that memory often became unreliable when truth was inconvenient. She remarked, almost absently, that people sometimes remembered events differently depending on what they hoped would come of them. The observation was met with a nervous laugh, quickly echoed by another, though neither sounded entirely convinced. A small domestic detail caught Miss Marple's attention then. Near the fireplace, a small clock ticked steadily, its sound more noticeable during the pauses in conversation. Miss Marple observed how often eyes flicked toward it, as though time itself were pressing them forward. Someone commented that it was getting late, though no one made any move to leave. As the clock chimed the hour, a man near the door cleared his throat and said that it would all be settled soon, that arrangements had been made. The statement was delivered with confidence, yet his eyes avoided those of everyone present. A woman responded quietly that she hoped so, her voice betraying doubt despite her words. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. She considered the repeated assurances, the emphasis on settlement without any clear explanation of what had been settled at all. She remarked gently that true resolution usually required everyone to agree on what had happened. The comment was met with polite nods, though one person's lips tightened noticeably. The hostess rose again, this time to fetch something from the adjoining room. In her absence, the atmosphere shifted, voices lowering instinctively. Miss Marple heard a whisper about how things had gone too far, followed by another insisting that there was no turning back now. The exchange ended abruptly when footsteps sounded in the hall. When the hostess returned, she carried a small tray, which she placed carefully on the table. Miss Marple noticed how she positioned it so that it partially obscured a stack of papers lying beneath. The movement was subtle, deliberate. Miss Marple did not comment, though she made a mental note of the placement. A guest mentioned, with forced cheerfulness, that the village would soon return to its usual calm. Miss Marple agreed that calm was a precious thing, though she added that it was often mistaken for peace. The distinction seemed to unsettle more than one person. Someone laughed too loudly, filling the space with sound. As the evening drew on, fatigue began to show. Politeness slipped in small ways. Remarks sharpened just enough to sting. A woman accused another of exaggerating her concerns, her tone dismissive. The reply was quiet but firm, insisting that concerns were justified when promises were involved. The exchange was brief, quickly smoothed over by the hostess. Yet Miss Marple noted how both women avoided looking at one another afterward. When it was finally time to leave, people rose with visible relief, gathering their things more quickly than they had arrived. Miss Marple thanked the hostess sincerely, remarking on the warmth of the gathering. The hostess smiled, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. As Miss Marple turned toward the door, she heard a voice behind her say, urgently, that everything depended on tomorrow. The reply came in a whisper she could not quite catch. Outside, the night air was cool, the village quiet beneath the stars. Miss Marple walked slowly, allowing the events of the evening to settle in her mind. She reflected on the repeated references to arrangements, the guarded movements, the way politeness had begun to fray at the edges. She paused at the corner, looking back toward the warmly lit windows she had just left. Inside, everything would look calm again, orderly, composed. Yet Miss Marple knew how easily such appearances could deceive. She had seen too many situations where the effort to maintain harmony only hastened its collapse. As she resumed her walk, her expression gentle but thoughtful, Miss Marple felt certain that whatever had been set in motion could no longer be contained by courtesy alone. The promise, once spoken softly and set aside, had begun to assert itself with quiet insistence. And Miss Marple, listening to the distant ticking of a clock carried faintly through an open window, knew that time was no longer an ally, and that the next step, whatever it might be, would leave no room for careful politeness at all. Chapter 7. The shift came not with a confrontation, but with a softness that felt almost like relief, the kind that settles when something long avoided is finally named. Miss Marple sensed it early that morning, in the way the village seemed to exhale as she stepped outside, as though everyone were aware that the careful balancing act could not continue much longer. Doors opened more readily, greetings lasted a second longer, and beneath it all ran a current of nervous anticipation. She was invited, quite politely, to sit with a small group in the front room of a familiar house, the request phrased as a wish for clarity rather than confession. Miss Marple accepted without hesitation. She understood that moments like this did not come by chance. The room was bright with morning light, curtains drawn back as if secrecy itself had become too tiring to maintain. Chairs were arranged closer than before. The distance between people narrowed in a way that suggested resolve, or perhaps resignation. Conversation began slowly, cautiously. Someone spoke of how unsettling the past weeks had been, how exhausting it was to carry unresolved matters. Another agreed, adding that silence had begun to feel heavier than any argument might have been. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded calmly, her expression attentive. She did not interrupt. She rarely needed to. A woman cleared her throat and said that perhaps it was time everything was put plainly, that misunderstandings thrived in half-spoken truths. Her voice wavered, but she continued, explaining how the old promise had never truly disappeared, how it had shaped decisions long after everyone pretended it no longer mattered. As she spoke, Miss Marple noticed how one man's shoulders slumped, as though a burden had finally been acknowledged aloud. Miss Marple spoke then, gently, thanking the woman for her honesty. She remarked that such promises often took on lives of their own, changing meaning as circumstances changed. She observed, almost casually, that the letters she had seen suggested not a single agreement, but several revisions of one, each shaped by fear or convenience. The room grew quiet, not with shock, but with recognition. Someone protested that everything had been done for the best, that intervention had been necessary at the time. Miss Marple nodded, agreeing that intentions were rarely unkind at the start. Yet she added that outcomes mattered just as much, especially when someone was left bearing the cost. Her words were mild, but they settled heavily. A man near the window spoke up, his voice tight, admitting that he had believed the matter resolved years ago, until threats of exposure began to surface. He described the fear of scandal, of everything carefully built being undone by a single revelation. Miss Marple listened closely, noting how his account avoided one crucial detail, the moment when fear had turned into action. She asked a small question then, almost conversational, about timing, about how certain meetings aligned so neatly with the disappearance of key documents, about how one person's account placed them in two locations at once. The question was not accusatory, merely curious, yet it caused a visible reaction. Someone inhaled sharply. Another looked down at their hands. Miss Marple continued, her tone kind as though explaining something simple. She pointed out how the rewritten letter softened language that had once been firm, how the key she had noticed suggested access that had never been acknowledged. She spoke of patterns, of how people repeated the same reassurances when they were trying to convince themselves rather than others. The room felt smaller now, the air close. A woman began to cry quietly, not from guilt, but from relief. She admitted that she had always known the promise had been twisted, that silence had seemed easier than truth. Miss Marple offered her a handkerchief, her manner gentle, understanding. At last, all eyes turned toward one person who had remained silent throughout. Miss Marple did not look at them directly at first. She spoke instead about how desperation narrowed choices, how ordinary people sometimes made irreversible decisions to protect what they believed was theirs. Only then did she lift her gaze, meeting theirs calmly. The response came slowly, carefully. Denial, softened by explanation. Justification framed as necessity. Miss Marple listened without interruption. When the words ended, she spoke once more, pointing out a single inconsistency, a detail so small it might have been overlooked by anyone less attentive. The timing of a visit. The placement of a document. The lie that had been repeated too often to remain steady. Silence followed, deep and unmistakable. No one rushed to fill it. The truth, once spoken, needed space to settle. Miss Marple rose then, smoothing her skirt, her expression composed. She said that the village would soon need to decide how it wished to live with what had been uncovered. But that denial was no longer an option. She added, gently, that the past had already done its worst, and that facing it now might be the only kindness left. As she stepped outside, the village seemed altered, though nothing visible had changed. Windows reflected the same sky. Paths lay where they always had. Yet Miss Marple felt the shift clearly. The promise, long hidden and reshaped, had finally been exposed to daylight. She walked slowly away, her thoughts calm, but alert, knowing that truth rarely ended matters neatly. It merely removed the illusion of safety, and Miss Marple, hearing voices rise behind her in anxious discussion, understood that the final act was close at hand, and that what had begun as a quiet promise would soon demand its full and unavoidable reckoning. Chapter 8. The confession did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but with a stillness that felt heavier than any argument. Miss Marple sensed it before a single word was spoken. In the way the room had gone quiet, not the polite quiet of good manners, but the kind that follows when everyone knows there is nothing left to protect. Morning light filtered through the window, soft and forgiving, touching faces that looked suddenly older, worn by weeks of restraint and years of careful silence. They had gathered again, almost without planning it, drawn together by the shared knowledge that the matter could not be postponed any longer. Chairs were pulled close, not for comfort, but necessity. Miss Marple sat slightly apart, as she always did, her presence calm, her expression gentle, as though she were merely listening to a story already half told. She allowed the silence to stretch, knowing that truth often needed a moment of patience before it could speak. It was Mrs. Calder who finally broke it, her voice low and even, as though she had rehearsed the words many times in her own mind. She spoke of the promise made years ago, of how it had begun sincerely enough, an agreement shaped by hope and expectation. She admitted that when circumstances changed, when money tightened, and reputation felt suddenly fragile, fear had taken hold. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting how her hands rested flat on her knees, no longer fidgeting, as though the effort of concealment had finally ended. Mrs. Calder explained how the letters had been altered, not entirely rewritten, but softened just enough to change their meaning. How she had convinced herself that it was kindness, sparing others unnecessary pain. Miss Marple listened, without interruption, though she noticed how carefully the account avoided the final step. The moment when persuasion had turned into something more deliberate. Another voice joined in then, hesitant at first, confirming the meetings, the quiet pressure applied behind closed doors. Miss Marple observed how the speaker's eyes kept returning to Mrs. Calder, not in accusation but expectation. The room seemed to lean inward, every small sound amplified. Miss Marple spoke at last, her tone warm, almost conversational. She remarked that fear often disguised itself as practicality, that people told themselves they were acting sensibly when they were, in fact, protecting only themselves. She recalled the key she had noticed, the one that allowed access when none had been acknowledged. She mentioned the timing of the final meeting, how it aligned too neatly with the disappearance of the last unaltered letter. Mrs. Calder's composure wavered then. She admitted that the threat of exposure had terrified her, that she believed everything she had built would collapse if the promise resurfaced unchanged. She spoke of the night she confronted the one person who still insisted on honoring it, of words spoken in anger and desperation. She insisted it had not been planned, that she had only meant to frighten them into silence. Miss Marple nodded gently, acknowledging the explanation without endorsing it. She pointed out, quietly, how the arrangement of the room had told a different story, how the documents had already been gathered, how the timing had been too precise to be coincidence. Her voice never rose. It did not need to. The truth settled slowly, like dust after a long disturbance. Mrs. Calder's shoulders sagged, the effort of resistance finally gone. She admitted then that she had acted deliberately, believing that removing the problem was the only way to preserve her life as it was. The room remained silent, not out of shock, but recognition. Everyone had seen pieces of it, Miss Marple realized. They had simply chosen not to assemble them. Miss Marple spoke once more, kindly but firmly, explaining how the promise itself had not destroyed anything. It was the fear of keeping it that had done the harm. She observed that small choices, repeated often enough, could lead ordinary people to irreversible acts. No one argued with her. As the gathering dissolved, voices subdued and movements slow, Miss Marple stepped outside into the quiet lane. The village looked much as it always had, orderly and peaceful beneath the pale sky. Yet something fundamental had changed. The illusion of safety had been replaced by a sober understanding, and in its place lay the possibility of honesty. Miss Marple walked on, her pace unhurried, her thoughts calm. She reflected that mysteries rarely ended with satisfaction alone. They ended with clarity, and clarity, she knew, carried its own weight. And as the church bells rang softly in the distance, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile, knowing that the promise which had once threatened to destroy this village had finally spoken its truth, and in doing so had brought the long, careful silence to its inevitable end.